Hi, I'm Josh, and I am genuinely grateful that you've chosen to spend some of your valuable time with me as I talk about the board games that I played in the month of March. So, coming off of my worst gaming month so far in February, I have to say that March wasn't that bad. I played a total of 8 different games in the month, 2 of which were new to me, so I got to try out a couple of new ones. One of those games wasn't that great, the other was quite a lot of fun, so let's go right to it. As usual, I'll go through these 8 games in order of my lowest rated game of the month to my highest rated game. Most of these games I was able to get to the table thanks to family gaming. However, I did get one gaming session in with Paul in March, and during that session we got to play one of the new to me games. This game was Glasgow. I had picked it up in the previous month in February through an auction of used games that somebody was hosting on BoardGameGeek, so I picked it up for like $10 or something, and Paul and I got it to the table. And first of all, there are a couple of things I will say in favor of the game. First of all, the theme, Glasgow, appeals to me immediately because as a Canadian here who has relatives on my mother's side in Scotland, I did in my early 20s have the wonderful opportunity to travel to Scotland to visit family members of my mum's father who lived in Dundee and on the Isle of Skye in Portree. So I made Dundee my home base in the south of Scotland and toured Glasgow and Edinburgh, of course, so I was in Glasgow for at least a full day there. Then I took the train up to Skye and toured the Isle of Skye and hung out in Portree for a while. So Glasgow, as a theme, immediately appeals to me. The game itself is a quick and easy 2-player game. However, in looking on BoardGameGeek on the forum threads talking about this game prior to our first play, I did notice some complaints that had to do with the game's randomness, and people had made various suggestions about ways to set up and play the game that perhaps could negate some of that randomness. So I took what I thought were the best of those suggestions and I implemented them into my own sort of group of variants that I'll put them up on the screen here briefly. If Glasgow is a game that interests you and you want to play it, here are some suggestions of variants that will reduce the luck aspect of the game a little bit. I chose to go with the simpler of the 2 options at the bottom of that sheet where it says or in between them, so we went with the easy one and it seemed to work out fairly well. I ended up losing the game by a decent margin. Paul ended up with 42 points and I had 32 at the end of the game. One physical complaint I had about the actual components of the game was the fact that the tiles that you're using to build up that city are so tiny, and the symbols on them that show what kind of buildings they are even tinier. Like, I think the symbols themselves are about 5 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch wide roughly, and when they're out on the table in a group of tiles, they're so difficult to see. And I actually did get confused at one point during the game between 2 different building types. I thought I was building one type of building when it was another type of building. But like I said, it's a pretty simple game where you're just kind of marching your worker around a rondel, stopping on various tiles to either collect resources or build buildings into a shared city in the center of the table. And at the end of the game, you're getting points based on how you have built the different types of buildings. Each building type awards players points to their owners in different ways. So, you know, it was pretty straightforward, but at the end of the day, I thought it was just not very exciting. I ended up giving it a rating of 5.5 out of 10. Paul rated it 7.5 out of 10. And yeah, it's just, you know, one of those simple games where you walk around the circle, get resources, build buildings, see what happens, and there's really not much to it other than that. So I think this is a game that the next time I hold a game auction, this is one that's going to leave my collection. Next up is chess again. Playing it as usual on my app on my phone. I was thinking I should probably bump this rating up. I had I think been rating this game a 7 out of 10, although I might have in previous months slipped in the occasional 7.5 out of 10, but I realized this really needs to be at least a 7.5 out of 10 for all of the time I've spent exploring the game, especially in recent months. And I mean, it's chess, it probably should be 10 out of 10, but in terms of my own personal enjoyment level, it needs to have at least a 7.5 out of 10. Next, I was able to get together with my primary Magic the Gathering playing friend, and I was very excited to get some of my newly built decks to the table. So I have built several decks with the Lord of the Rings cards. So I made one deck featuring hobbits that I call Second Breakfast, another one based around Sauron that I called Mordor's Dark Forces, one with the Ents that I've named March of the Ents, one with Saruman called The Hordes of Isengard, and finally one with elves that I have titled The Mirror of Galadriel. So I was very excited to get my Lord of the Rings themed Magic decks to the table, and we had fun playing with those. You know, Magic has been coming up with all these kind of crazy IPs, and you know, the traditional Magic players are like, what's with all these weird themes that are so disparate and different from each other coming into play? It's kind of ruining our traditional fantasy Magic game. And for the most part, I'm like, yeah, I'm not interested in any of these IPs. You know, I'm pretty much done buying Magic cards. I have so many to work with at this point that I don't need any more. And then along comes Lord of the Rings, and I'm like, fine, you got me, Wizards of the Coast. I will buy Magic cards still. So, you know, I've ended up spending a bit of money on Lord of the Rings decks, thanks to my Patreon supporters for your help with that. You all really do make my hobbying possible, so thank you to my higher tier supporters in particular, Charles M, Mojo Dam, Saver Girl, Abo, Joanna N, and my highest tier supporter, Oswanda's Perfect. Appreciate it a lot. So yeah, Magic successfully hooked me back in with their Lord of the Rings stuff, but I had a great time playing with my decks. I rate Magic a 7.5 out of 10. In the previous month, in February, the only real game we got to the table was The Adventures of Robin Hood with the Friar Tuck in Danger expansion that I had played with my two boys, and they had absolutely loved it. If you saw my Games Played in February video, we were able to get 2 more adventures played, so now we've played 3 of the 4 adventures in the Friar Tuck in Danger expansion. We actually got our first scenario loss ever, because I tend to play this game on extra easy level. I always throw the gray disc into the bag that gives us an extra turn every round. Plus I add maybe just the extra hourglass token into the game just to extend the amount of time we have to play each scenario, because the thing is, this game is all about the adventure, the exploration, hearing the story, going to locations to seeing what happens, and it's just kind of frustrating to fail and to have to reset everything, which is a bit of work to set up these scenarios and then play through it again when we've already kind of experienced a bunch of the scenarios. So yeah, I do play on extra easy mode because the game for us is about the experience. It's not as much about winning. It is nice to have these parameters in play where there is a losing condition, so there is a bit of time pressure on us to get things done. Without that, it wouldn't be quite as interesting, but at the same time, I don't want to run a huge risk of losing repeatedly and having to grind through scenarios over and over again. So, like I said, we did have our first loss, but we replayed it and won on our second attempt, and we only have one final adventure to go with Friar Tuck in Danger. Of course, like I said in my previous video, this is one of my kids' favorite games, and like I mentioned, it's so hard to rate these family games because if I'm rating this game solely on its own in comparison to all the other games that I own, in terms of would I pick this game up off the shelf to play with my gaming friends, it's maybe like a 6 out of 10 game. But if I'm picking it up off the shelf to play with my kids, then it's just a perfect gaming experience to play with them, and it's more like a 10 out of 10. So ultimately I decided to split the difference between the 6 and the 10, and I rate this game 8 out of 10 at this point, just because it's such a super fun family game. Speaking of family games, the next 2 involve gaming with extended family members. So these are both 5-player games that I played with myself, my 2 boys, one of my brothers, and my brother's son / my nephew. We went over to their house. I brought along a couple of my party games, and the first one was Onironauts. This is a game that is like a cooperative Dixit. So you have all these cards with weird and wacky pictures on them, and players, well, for Onironauts, we have to basically have a random number generator on my phone because I can't get Onironauts anywhere here in Canada that I've been able to find so far. So I've cobbled together the game by taking Dixit, putting a random number generator on my phone, and adding some dice to mark things in the game, and it plays out fairly well. So each round every player is secretly submitting a card based on a word that comes up in the random word generator. Am I saying random number generator? It's a random word generator. And then we add a totally random card from the top of the deck and mix them all up and splay them out on the table. And then we all have to guess which of those cards is that random imposter from the deck as opposed to the cards the other players submitted. And if for every correct guess from the players, we gain points. If we get all of them correctly, we don't have to count down the round because we have a certain number of rounds to play out, and we're trying to reach a certain number of points in those number of rounds. So it's a cooperative experience. It's a ton of fun. And what's so cool is that the game we played with the 5 of us came right down to the wire, because in order to win, we needed to have a perfect round on the final round. And none of the previous rounds we had played were perfect rounds. We had always gotten at least one error, which was counting down our timer. So, and it's extra hard to do with 5 players because you have to have all 5 players guess the imposter card correctly. So it's very hard to accomplish. It was either get a perfect round or we all lose together. And what do you know? We pulled it off. We were all cheering. It was such a great moment. One of those things in board gaming that is the reason we play games, really. So I rate Outtakes an 8 out of 10. When we've played it with Paul in the past, he's rated it 9 out of 10. My boys were just kind of, it's a good game. Evan gives it 7 out of 10, Wyatt 6.5 out of 10. So they're not crazy about it, but they have fun when we do play it. So yeah, it's just one of those games that they're not going to request, but when I do bring it out in a group experience, they do have fun with it. The next game is very similar. It's called Just One. This is a game that I had actually purchased at Christmas time because I hosted my family Christmas this year, and I realized I didn't have very many good big group party games, so I picked up Just One, which is a word guessing game. Essentially, each round the guesser has to pick a word on a card without seeing what the word is. So every card has 5 words on it. The guesser basically picks a number between 1 and 5 to show everybody else what the word is. And then everybody else, again, cooperatively, has to try to give a 1-word clue that they write down for the guesser to try to guess what the word on the card is. The trick is, though, that if more than one player in the group puts the same clue word, they cancel out and they are removed before the guesser can even see the clues. So it's a type of thing where if there's an obvious clue that's going to really help the guesser figure out what that word is, you're thinking to yourself, okay, everybody else is going to think it's too obvious and somebody else is going to put it, so I'm going to be the one that puts it down. Or else you're thinking, no, this is the obvious one, someone else is going to put it, I'm going to try to think of something else. But the point is, you're all trying to work together to get the guesser to figure out what that word is, and it's a lot of fun. Like with most party games, though, this one doesn't come with a very good scoring system. It's obviously been designed to be a fun group experience, but in order to make it a game, they had to come up with some kind of scoring system, and what they came up with is pretty uninspiring. So I put together my own little scoring system that I'll put up on the screen here. It does require some very basic mathematics in order to calculate what percentage you have achieved for the game. So I can see why that might put people off for just a light and fun party game, but this is what we used. We played 3 rounds in total with the 5 of us, and using my scoring system, we scored a C, which was I think a 60% on the first 2 times, and then we scored a D on the 3rd time. So it's provided a decent challenge with some room for improvement, certainly, and we were really gunning to try to improve our score on that last round, but we just ended up getting worse. In looking at the game, I was thinking that Just One is going to be most ideally played with 5 to 7 players. And when I checked BoardGameGeek to see what the general user base there thought, they said that they thought it was best with 6 or 7. So it kind of corresponds with what I was thinking. So it's good for that very specific number of a small group of 5 to 7 people. I rate the game 8 out of 10. My kids are slightly higher on this than on Outtakes. Evan gives it an 8 out of 10. And Wyatt gives it a 7 out of 10. So once again, not the type of game that they're necessarily going to request to play, but when we play it, they're going to have fun with it. Now getting on to my 2 best games of the month. The next one is the other game that I played with Paul as a 2-player game when he was here, and that was 7 Wonders Duel with the Pantheon expansion. One of my favorite kind of small 2-player games. It was funny because I had recalled that in the previous game that Paul and I had played quite a long time ago now of 7 Wonders Duel with Pantheon, Paul had been going for the science victory. He was trying to collect all the science symbols to achieve victory that way, whereas I was going more for victory points, and I was doing really well with victory points. And I only had to prevent Paul from getting one more science symbol in order to deny him the victory. But at the last second, on the last round of the game, I just kind of got too focused on my victory points and forgot to deny him that last symbol, and he successfully acquired the science symbols and won a science victory. So this time when we were starting out, I noticed that Paul wasn't going after the science symbol, so I was like, okay, this time I'm going to hit the science victory condition hard. And I started to collect the science symbols, and I was actually doing pretty well coming up to the final round of the game. I was only one science symbol away from victory, but I got a little bit unlucky with the initial distribution of the cards, because every time you play Seven Wonders Duel, you have to randomly remove a few cards from each age, and it just so happened that one of the science symbols was removed from the game before we even started it. And of course, Paul was keeping an eye on what I was doing to make sure I didn't get that final science symbol that I needed. Ultimately, he won a victory point victory by 80 points to my 57. But it was fun to play this game again. I really like the Pantheon expansion. Together with the expansion, I rate it 8 out of 10, and Paul rates it 8.5 out of 10. There is one more expansion for Seven Wonders Duel, but I've looked at it and thought that it might not add to the game in the way that Pantheon did. I'm not sure if I'm going to really seek that one out, because I'm pretty content with the way the game plays as it is. But the very best of the month was a programming game, a game based around pre-planning your moves and playing them out on the board. This is Lords of Ziddit, and if that style of play sounds familiar from games that I talked about for January, I think it was, it's because I was able to get one of my other favorite programming games to the table with my boys, that being Colt Express. And I love the game. The kids, again, thought it was a fine game, but didn't particularly love Colt Express. There is a third game in my favorite programming games category, and that is Kings of Air and Steam. I should get that to the table sometime if I can. But anyways, this one is Lords of Ziddit, where players are heroes running around the land, recruiting various people, peasants, soldiers, clerics, warriors to their army, and then taking those recruits and going to fight monsters with them. And then when they defeat monsters, they get rewards, and they're ultimately vying to achieve victory by gaining superiority in 3 different things. So every time you defeat a monster in this game, the monster offers 3 rewards. They're the same 3 rewards for every monster, but every time you defeat one, you get to choose 2 of them. One is to simply collect gold and put it behind your player screen so that other players can't keep track of how much gold you have. The other is to build towers on the game board and accumulate the most tower pieces. And then the third one is to put your minstrels, these harp tokens, out into the regions of the board and try to have majorities of your minstrels in each region to gain points for the most and second most. But the really clever thing about the game is at the beginning of the game, those 3 different elements that we're working towards are randomly dealt out in order of how they're going to be evaluated at the end of the game. So in the case of the 4-player game we played with myself, Paul, and my 2 boys, I think the first thing we evaluated was who has the most gold. So we revealed the collected gold from behind our screens, and whoever had the smallest amount of gold was eliminated from the rest of the scoring. They were out. So then we went on to evaluate the points from our minstrels, and once again, the person who had the fewest points from their minstrels on the board was eliminated from the scoring. And then of the final 2 that were remaining, the one who had the most tower pieces on the board was the ultimate winner of the game. So it's such an interesting scoring system where you have to focus on all 3 of those scoring types in order not to be eliminated, but you have to have the most of the third one at the end to win. As it happens, Evan was eliminated first on the gold evaluation, then Paul was eliminated second on that minstrel points evaluation, and came down to me and Wyatt, and ultimately Wyatt ended up being the winner with the most tower pieces. So that was really cool for Wyatt, and he actually had the play of the game. On your planning board, you have this skip an action option, which is rarely used because you want to do as much as you can, as often as you can, but he decided to basically hang out and do nothing so that another player could first take a lesser value recruitment from a space and leave a higher value thing for him to pick up, just as the way the recruitment happens to work in the game. And so he did a skip action in order to kind of sneak around something that was happening to get a better recruitment. Anyways, Wyatt also ended up winning the game. I rated 8.5 out of 10, which I think is roughly the same as I rate both Colt Express and Kings of Air and Steam, I would imagine. Paul rates Lords of Zid at a 9 out of 10. It's funny, both he and I have really enjoyed this game for years and years, going way back to the previous edition of this game, which was a game called Himalaya, and I did like the theme of that one better. We had little yaks in it, you know, how can I not love it? But then they came out with Lords of Zid, which was kind of a version 2.0, and it added some interesting elements, and it still came out with this really great looking production with cool little minis that you were recruiting and that sort of thing. So anyways, Paul and I have enjoyed this one a lot for a long time, but it is one of those games where you really want probably 4 players is the sweet spot for the game. It'd probably work pretty well with 5 as well. But anyways, Evan rated it 8 out of 10 and Wyatt rated it 9 out of 10. So this one was a hit with my boys, and Evan did express interest in playing it again soon. So that is one that they did enjoy enough to think about playing again in the future. So that was pretty cool. And so that was my gaming month of March. It turns out it's a really good month in terms of the fact that of the 8 games I played, only one of them was rated below 7.5 out of 10 by me. So a lot of very highly rated fun games, a lot of great quality family gaming time. But I am genuinely interested in hearing from you about what sort of gaming you've been doing lately, what games have you been getting to the table, what have you been enjoying a lot lately, is there anything upcoming that you're excited to get hold of? I do really enjoy hearing all about it, so if you can, get into the comments and let's talk about it a little bit. I'd love to hear from you, and I just really appreciate you watching. Cheers. Hi. Coming off of my worst month of the year in February, worst month of the year. And so I made one deck that I called and then along comes Lord of the yeah, it's one of the good. Like with most. All right, now moving on to my 2 best of the month. We have the other game that I played with Paul. We played, I'm going to catch my breath. They're going up and down the stairs. Now getting on. The third one, and that's the Kings of Air and that. So then we went on to evaluate the number of